to another episode of Mixed Mental Heart. Oh, see, I can never make fun of Bryan for screwing up the name of our show. The show is called Mixed Mental Arts, not Mixed Martial Arts, and not the Bryan Colan and Hunter Maats show. And now that I've done a suitably bad introduction, allow me to introduce some suitably wonderful guests. Previously we had on Dave Colan, who is a improv teacher at Second City, and he was super jealous that I got to talk to Spiros Michalakis, quantum physicist at Caltech. And so originally it was just going to be to bring those two together. But then Cate was like, I want to talk about physics. And Andrew Hunt was like, well, you're using my space. Do I not to get to participate in this conversation? And then Bryan Colan said, oh, and also we should do a podcast. And I said, well, we're doing one Thursday at 2:30. And he's like, great, I'll be there. And then he said, oh, wait, no, sorry. I actually have to go to Philly and do stand-up. So once again, Bryan Colan is no longer at the podcast that was formerly named after him. And instead I have these four wonderful guests. And I guess this is the first salon of the show formerly known as the Bryan Colan Show. Of course, it being done without Bryan Colan. So have at it, guys.
Well, I'm super excited to be here.
Thank you, Hunter, for having me.
Thank you, Hunter.
Thank you, Hunter.
Well, I actually have a question for Spiros, and it actually has to do with the double split experiment, because you kind of referenced that on the last...
You called it double split?
Double slit.
Like, okay, no, he's like Jean-Claude Van Damme right there, right? That's the only person I know who can do that. So. Double slit experiment, yeah.
Well, when I had it explained to me, it became something that was so fascinating, because I started to recognize that the observer made all the difference. And I wondered how it affected people in like the everyday world. How can we run experiments where the observer actually changes the effect of the electron or the human being or the result?
Well, I mean, that's actually something that is already, I think, a big deal in anthropology, as far as I know, right? You know, when the issue of being embedded in some culture that you're trying to study, and then they're trying to actually please you or act more like you expect them to act, right? So just by you being there and interacting with them, even though you're like, no, I'm just supposed to be, just here observing, changes the very nature of what you observe. So that's actually exactly what happens in the quantum realm as well. Because you have this interaction, right? We were discussing that last time with Hunter, that whenever you observe something, it's not just a magical act, right? Observation means some type of communication. We usually don't talk about that, right? It's supposed to be, I just observed the wall, but you never actually observe the thing in itself. You observe light that bounces off the wall, comes into your retina, is getting processed, and then you think of that as having observed the wall, right? So even if you had the perfect equipment inside of your brain, right, so it understands the raw data without any encoding or anything like that, you still wouldn't be observing the thing in itself. You would be observing the entangled messenger that was sent out to that thing and then was brought back to you to carry that information. So in a sense, I guess I never really considered that, but the wall is also observing us as we speak right now.
Whoa, spooky action at a distance. So Dave, you were super excited to be here. Why don't you tell us about the huge crush that you have on physics, but not Spiros specifically?
Spiros is new to me.
Give it time.
Listen, once you walked in the door, there was magic, and our texts have been amazing. The first text I received from a man who was like, "Oh, I'm really anxious to pick his brain and just have a conversation with him," was, "Has he seen me in a Speedo yet?"
I cannot confirm nor deny this.
I can confirm it, and Spiros is not your typical quantum physicist.
No, he's a good-looking guy. For those of you who are listening to this and think that you're talking about a nerd or something like that, this guy works out, probably.
My brain.
Not just his brain. He's wearing a tight shirt. Not too tight, not too tight to be cocky, but tight enough to be like...
I'm glad that we've already lowered the tone of this podcast.
That's great.
That's
to
my
the
job.
quantum level.
That's my job. So for me, I just am fascinated with quantum physics, with where they are. I'm sure you know, like, and maybe you hate him. I read all Brian Greene's books when they come out.
He's a great guy. I mean, he explains things, I think, really well, but he comes usually from a point of view of a string theorist, right?
Right, he's a string theorist.
And so that's, I mean, this is a very fascinating perspective because we thought a string theory would be the answer to quantum gravity, right? To that theory of everything that Stephen Hawking has been talking about. To how do you marry? We discussed this again last week with Hunter. How do you marry general relativity, which is the theory Einstein developed like 100 years ago, about gravity and about its relation to, or equivalence actually, to the curvature of space-time, right? A single object. So how do you marry that theory, which is really successful? It explains a lot of stuff, allows us to actually send, Curiosity rover to Mars without missing Mars by 100,000 kilometers, right, or something like that. But the other very successful theory is that of quantum field theory, what we call the standard model, which is supposed to describe all the particles and the interactions that we've seen so far. There was a very big hoopla about the Higgs boson being discovered also a few years ago and getting a Nobel Prize. So these are two different theories. Quantum field theory with its manifest child, which we call the standard model, right? So quantum field theory itself is actually more powerful than what we know right now. It just, we can't compute yet everything, right? And the reason why we can compute stuff is usually because we end up getting infinities. When we try to look at very small scales, especially when you try to understand gravity, right? So whenever you think, like the audience, for everyone listening to this, whenever you think of gravity, literally start thinking about like a squishy balloon, right? And as you squeeze the balloon, you create gravity literally by creating curvature in the balloon, right? So if gravity as a force, as we think of it, if it is a force, right, is equivalent to some curvature in space-time, then what you want to understand, right, is the curvature of space-time at the quantum level. Now, this creates a problem, right? A very simple and intuitive problem, at least from my point of view. It's kind of like saying, when you look at your own t-shirt, right? No matter how tight it is, there's going to be some curvature around your pecs, right? Or whatever, female, something else. Then there's going to be some curvature there. And so, but if you keep zooming in, at some point, the fibers will no longer have even a notion of curvature. Right? It will not be, it is a macroscopic, like temperature is kind of like a macroscopic effect. When you zoom in and you keep assuming that you're going to have the same smooth, view of that world, it breaks down because you have empty space at some point, right? You have, even within the fibers themselves, they're made of smaller stuff and so on and so forth. And there is no notion of curvature, right? What is the curvature of an atom at that point? And further down. So that's the problem, that when you're looking at very large scales, you coarse grain, right? Truncate and coarse grain. But like you coarse grain, you zoom out a lot, and all of a sudden, even in computer graphics, for example, whenever you play a video game or you watch anything, right, that is created digitally, it is a triangulation, usually. It is not a smooth surface. Even a sphere, it is something that is made up of like 1 million polygons, right? And then if your CPU or GPU, your graphics processor, is very strong, usually you can actually Google that. It will say how many polygons can it draw per second, right? And you have like billions. So that means you have a very, very smooth surface, right? You have to zoom in a lot before you can start seeing what we call the pixels, right? Or these little polygons, because it's discrete. It's not continuous, right? So the problem with quantum gravity and where string theory comes in, to go back to Brian Greene, is that string theory is supposed to be that, like, okay, when you zoom in all the way to the bottom, right, that the reason why these infinities go away is because it says, well, what you see is little strings, vibrating strings, connected strings, this kind of stuff. It's like chain mail, right? That's what it's made of. That's what the fabric, that's the fibers, right? But personally, I think you have to go deeper, right? It's not enough. That's not like, this is just, this already exists. The strings themselves already exist within space-time or on top of space-time itself, right? And they give rise to the quantum fields and all that stuff. In my mind, the real question is, where does space-time itself come from, right? What makes the fibers? Sure, they look like little strings, but what makes the strings themselves, right? And that's where I find it fascinating, because in quantum physics, or what is called quantum theory, there is no notion of space-time. There is actually no notion of space-time. It's only when you elevate the conversation to a different, the level where you assume space-time. Both on the left side, where is the quantum field theory, where you have quantum fields on top of this like blob called space-time, right? Mm-hmm. And then on the right side, where you have general relativity, and then you have the solutions to Einstein's equations, which is that theory, give you actually these blobs, the space-times on top of which you put the fields, right? The ones that are supposed to be compatible with a finite speed of light, right? And what we call general covariance, the equivalence principle, that the laws of physics are supposed to be the same, anywhere in space and throughout time and all that stuff. So these are assumptions. And what I want to do is like remove these assumptions without like breaking the whole Jenga tower that we've built so far, right? Slowly removing here and there to see at which point does the whole thing fall apart, because you just removed too many assumptions, right? Or something that was really foundational. And then understand that, because in mathematics, that's what we do all the time too, right? We build foundations. Upon foundations, we call axioms. And there is a definition of an axiom, right? Which is kind of crappy, but it's kind of self-promotional, right? It says if something is a self-evident truth, that's an axiom. But that means it's very, like, even though we say mathematics is like, very objective and everything, right? And it is on solid ground, it's not quite true the moment that you choose a set of axioms and you say, that's it, right? In fact, it's so powerful how we bring into even the world of mathematics our own faith in what is supposed to be true, right? That I think it was Immanuel Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason that he built like morality, not just like, metaphysics, but like morality itself upon a simple axiom that says that space and time cannot be anything but just flat, which is just a single solution to Einstein's equations, by the way. And now we know that's because in his mind, it was a self-evident truth, right? If you close your eyes, he imagined, right? The canvas of concepts and ideas where he could analyze and synthesize stuff was this empty black space. And he couldn't imagine how this can be anything but flat, right? And on top of that, he built, like, as we said, morality that is like worse than Victorian morality in certain, cases. But at the same time, that's because he couldn't imagine, his intuition would not allow him at the time, ironically, because he was around the time when, for the first time, we found different geometries, right? With different axioms. And so he was just not paying attention maybe to that. He was a brilliant guy, but he was like, this is hard enough for me to do what I'm doing, right? I'm just going to take this as self-evident. But now we know that we live in a curved space-time, right? That is not even flat. So the first question of many that I have based on this, and maybe there's no answer, maybe no. With the curvature of space-time, right? This is nerdy, I told you. When you talk about the balloon, if I push on a balloon and I stretch it out a little bit, so when it snaps back, it's a little bigger. Does that happen in space-time? I see. That's very interesting. So you're stretching space-time, and we know that there is also inflation, right? That there is what we call a positive cosmological, constant. Yes. So we are accelerating. There is more space created, per second, right? I think this is pretty deep stuff. And the reason why I say this is pretty deep stuff is because the way I think of it, and maybe I'm wrong, but the way I think of it is always with respect to what is happening at the level of the quantum theory, where space-time is emergent from something else, a deeper reality, right? So I want to understand what it means for more space to come to being, to crystallize, right? With respect to something that has no change, something that is actually a blob, a piece of data, you can think of it, right? We live inside of a big blob that does not change with respect to itself. There is no distances or changes with respect to itself, because there's nothing to change with respect to, right? It's the whole thing. But the things inside of it, we are like small data points inside of this very large structure. Those can change relative to each other, right? And more importantly, the data can be correlated. It's a very powerful idea, right? And especially in quantum physics, this is what we call quantum entanglement. If one piece of data, right, feels different every time something happens to another piece of data in your database, right, that's literally a correlation. And in the quantum universe, because of the mathematical foundation, right, of this particular data structure, this can lead to very non-local effects, meaning that the data itself doesn't have a notion of distance, this data point with that data point within this big data structure. It doesn't know. There's only correlations. You do something here, nothing changes to most of the things, but a few things change. So what do? At least my opinion is that we bring this closer, right? To keep them, to create a theory of the universe, right? You want to compress it to like a few equations, right? This is insane. Usually you cannot do that because you cannot predict what is going to happen next. So it has to be some filter, right? Some operation happening there where we are allowed to compress an infinite richness of data to like a very small like equation you can write down plus some initial conditions you put there, right? And you can predict anything. So in my mind, I think it comes from these correlations. These correlations, the stronger they are, the closer we imagine these data structures, these subsystems inside of this blob to be. So we can keep track of them because, if one of them lights up and then only a few of them light up and they're everywhere, you're like, I want to bring you close. And then you do the same thing with something far away and then you see that it has a neighborhood of its own little blobs that also light up. And you keep doing that and you literally create a universe out of this, right? And that explains, I think, in my mind, why Einstein was so freaked out by the spooky action at a distance. It was backwards, right? It was not that entanglement allows you to communicate, right, along like incredible distances immediately, because he was thinking space-time was the fundamental object and correlations were built on top of that, right? The closer you were, the stronger the correlation, he thought. I'm saying it's backwards. The stronger the correlation, the closer you can imagine these things being, but they don't have to be.
Right.
Right? You get to interpret the strength of the correlations with some particular embedding in some space that looks like a geometry, and you can do it in many different ways. If you were to increase the dimensions, you may even like have two things that used to be very far away, like a snake, for example, like doubling over itself. You can the head of the snake can be right next to its tail if you allow for a second dimension, right? And it can just go around, and all of a sudden you have removed some of the tension from these correlations. It was, the head and the tail had very strong correlation, but in one dimension, they had to be very far away, and it made no sense, right? But the moment you doubled it over and you allowed yourself to have an extra dimension to explore that data structure, all of a sudden it's local, right? It's right there. The weirdness goes away.
Yeah.
But it isn't, I think this sort of gets to a lot of what the progress of human knowledge of physics has been, which is that, as we talked about the last time, the Newtonian mechanics and, gravity acting at a distance without things physically touching, that was conceptually weird at the time. And so now, there's just in the same thing, we talked about the photoelectric effect and the discovery of quantum theory. That was weird at the time. Yeah. And so again and again, we are running up against how we tend to think as macroscopic creatures that have brains that are evolved for a very particular environment of throwing rocks and picking food and whatever else it is.
I used to throw the javelin for 10 years straight. So, I had practice with Newtonian mechanics.
And you will be doing that again, I believe, in the Culture Matters videos in said Speedo.
I see. Okay.
You've been cast, Spiros, and we don't intend to recast. But so a lot of this all to listeners, this of course sounds very strange because maybe our listenership is now entirely quantum physicists. So they're like, yeah, this is obvious,
self-selected
dude.
Audience, yeah.
But to people who aren't necessarily familiar with these ideas, it's incredibly strange, as it was strange to Einstein to think that. Yeah. I think you may have used this last time in the analogy of think about all the humans on Earth. Well, it might be that 6 of us in this room have strong relationships, but it could be that I have a stronger relationship with, say, my parents who happen to be on the other side of the world in Dubai. So it's not necessarily that the strongest correlations, as you're saying, are the most physically close ones.
That's right, exactly. You fall in love, right? You know exactly what it feels to be in love with somebody on the other side of the world, and yet you feel the most connected. Right? You're thinking about them, like you want to talk to them more than other people. It is exactly the same way. And there is a tension, as I was saying, if you think it is literally, I'm not even making this up, it is a quantum matrix, like just a matrix, right? It is a quantum matrix. It's a version of the matrix, but a quantum version of it. It's more rich, right? It is like more powerful. It can be superposition of things at the same time, right? And all that stuff. And I think it is interesting to think of it that way because it makes more sense when you're looking at you're watching a show on your TV or your laptop, right? You know, the pixels that correspond to somebody's face, right? Those are physically next to each other, right? But the data that corresponds to these pixels, right? The hue and saturation and color and temperature, right? You know, of these pixels, that is not in space, right? That what they represent, the fact that when they all come together and they know to make a face, that is not because they are physically next to each other, right? Mm-hmm. It is because the colors that they represent, right? Luminosity and all that stuff. This comes from a data structure where these pixels may be represented along some array, right? Computer science array in your programming language, whatever you have encoded it in. And in the array, the pixel that is like right next to each other is like 100 units in the array, like entries far away from each other, right? And vice versa. There's like, in that sense, there is no connection, right? At the level of this array, they're very far away. But whenever you look at them in your screen, they always seem to be the same color or like really very close to the same color. And that's because of this like deeper representation, the data, the correlations that they inherently carry, right? And that's it. I mean, look at the world that way, but it's just we're so used to, we build intuition and we build our science from observations, right? And that goes to something like, I think, more interesting, that science is never going to be complete. You know, it will never give you the truth. And in fact, like the way we do science, okay, is there is one aspect of science that is, I think, the most powerful aspect of the scientific method. And it is neither the repeatability, nor the fact that we go out there and we look at the world, right? It is the one that tries to outdo itself, right? The one that says, like, you're not done yet. Okay, whenever you think you're done, you're probably missing something, right? And we discussed it last week too, this idea that we truncate and renormalize, right? Meaning that we create a model of the world based on all the questions we could possibly ask right now, right? With our eyes, our ears, our mouths, with our best experimental, devices. And then we can only get certain aspects of the thing in itself, right? What Plato called the thing in itself, okay? We just get projections, we get these shadows, and we make the best representation kind of like by inverting that map, right? And saying, oh, that must come from this kind of object. Mm. But the problem with that is that our inability to explore that object from all of its facets, right? From all these different viewpoints, in all its different dimensions, ends up giving us a very poor representation. But sometimes we get lucky and in a sense unlucky. And there's a very beautiful, simple picture to describe this smaller, subset of the real thing, right? And we're like, that's it. That must make sense. And in fact, that's what you call Newton's gravitational, theory, right? And all of a sudden, that was subsumed by a more general theory, where even light, where there is no mass, could still bend around, heavy gravitational, objects, right? And that's the point, We keep, truncating and renormalizing, but science also has an aspect of it that says, wait a minute, I think we just did that. Mm-hmm. Let's try to undo that because this doesn't explain potentially something either in somebody's head. That's why Einstein had to do Gedanken experiments, thought experiments, because he couldn't do gravitational lensing experiments yet, or gravitational wave detection yet. But in our heads, as mathematical beings, right, as ones that can computationally imagine ambient spaces where other things could happen, we can posit certain questions and say, okay, what if this ambient theory, which reduces to this one that we believe is the true one, right? What if this larger one is true, actually? And then you test that. And kind of like everything, around every balloon, there's a bigger balloon, right? But you have to choose the right balloon. And maybe there is a really smart way of doing that, of inductively inflating that balloon until you cover everything. But as I said, there will never be that point where we can cover everything, right? That's the fun of the scientific enterprise, that you just keep inflating until you burst your own bubble.
And the point is that science is evolutionary, and that it always should be evolutionary, and that there isn't some point at which science becomes about, oh, we have accumulated all this dogma, all this knowledge, and now it's about memorizing that dogma. And this is part of what we talked about in terms of Atul Gawande, where he said that the scientific mind is an experimental one, not a litigious one.
Yes, and that I mean, yeah, that's and that's powerful, right? Because I think what is the place of a scientist in society, right? And what are some of the transferable skills, right? If any one of us were to go into politics, what could we possibly offer outside of like being consultants or scientific consultants or experts in something? And I think it's that. It is the fact that and we are human beings, right? You know, so we're not gonna like fake it and say no, we're just better at this than everybody else. But you do get good at failing, right? And understanding that failure is actually success. Okay, it means like you're hitting against something that is beyond your grasp right now. You had an initial idea, right, belief, something you were emotionally invested in, and you're like, that has to be true because kind of like Immanuel Kant, right? It has to be flat and all that stuff until you find this other ambient theory, and you're like, wow. I was wrong, but this is even more beautiful than what I thought, and I've learned something, right? And then you may even understand why you really thought this other thing was true, but in this larger context. And you grow like that. And I think this is really awesome, right?
And something I just want to point out right now, I had two quick thoughts, but one of them is something I find fascinating about talking to actual scientists about this, as opposed to like, I read books on string theory and like, I don't get stoned anymore, but when I did, I really think about it, is that I've approached, and I have more questions for you, but I've approached scientists with, you know, I've talked to one other physicist about some of these questions, and they're always more caught up in the process of like, well, we don't know. And I'm like, no. I want to know your thought, your opinion. And they're like, I don't know. It hasn't happened yet, you know? And that's always really interesting to me as somebody who's not a physicist. Yeah. I have questions about like the nature of time. Does the Higgs boson create time? And I can ask all those questions later.
We'll answer all of these. Those are simple.
But a physicist, you know, a lot of physicists I talk to are like, oh, well, that's sort of beyond what we know. Yeah. Or when I've talked to scientists, that's beyond what we know. And I'm like, yeah, but what do you think? And they're like, I think that's beyond what we know.
So annoying, isn't it?
Right. So it's annoying. It is. To some degree, it's annoying to have people saying that. But getting back to the mission of mixed mental arts, you just said the thing about being litigious. Yeah. When you read stuff on creationism, when you read stuff on pseudoscience, it's almost always litigious. It's almost always, we know, and the reason we know is, here's the holes I've been able to poke in the other side. Yeah. And when you talk to a scientist says, I don't know, because here are the holes on my side.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, I would say, though, that at the same time, if you talk to scientists a little bit more, they're like, no, but we really know this, and we know this, and obviously we know this, and like, we're kind of BSing too, right? You know, right. It's just more of a matter of being self-aware. And it is important that we realize that, because if we don't, then we'll never be able to bridge that gap between the humans, as you said, that are more litigious, right? And the ones that are more like inquisitive, right? We are the same people. It's just a matter of a degree of like, how much were you rewarded for being inquisitive versus knowing the right answer, right? So it goes like back a bit, because yes, a scientist will say like, yeah, we don't know. But the next thing we're going to say, like, I would love to find out. If it's interesting, like, I'm going to do an experiment. I'm going to actually try to figure this out. Versus the other side, which is like, well, I don't know. I don't have time for this. Like, that's good enough for me. And that's okay. Sometimes you just need to take a break, right, from the world and just sit back and drink some beer. You know, you don't have to think about the universe all the time. I think about the universe when I'm drinking beer. I don't have time for this when I'm not drinking beer. You should. I do comedy when I'm not doing this. That should be a commercial, right? You know,
I spend a lot of time not drinking beer thinking of fart jokes. So
that's work. That's the real work.
We have complementary worldviews.
Well, that's part of why I was excited to get you guys together. But I think, to Dave's point, the other part of that, coming from the perspective of science communication, is that this is very often why science is so poorly communicated, because the legit scientists, the people who are actually really doing the work, are so experimental and so tentative. And we've had so many wonderful people on the show formerly called The Bryan Callen Show, who, you know, people like Jon Haidt or Dacher Keltner or David Sloan Wilson or Jennifer Jacquet, or Richard Nisbett, and these are naturally sort of mild-mannered people. And they aren't litigious. And litigiousness is so much of how people have made a name for themselves on social media.
Like who?
Well, I suppose we should address the elephant in the room.
Are you talking about Sam Harris? I'm sorry, am I pronouncing his name right? Sam Harris?
It's actually Sam Harissa.
Sam Harissa.
He's actually a self-hating Muslim.
The spicy condiment.
I'm sorry about all of this, everyone.
So Bryan and I have talked about this before, and we'd actually moved on from my, as Bryan termed it, experiment. And Cate will know, and Dave knows, and Andrew knows that the focus was going to be on creating original content. Cate Fogarty has been creating great knowledge bombs. We have this Culture Matters series. And Andrew has been kind enough to lend us this amazing space where we're now recording the podcast. And I should also give a shout out to Christopher Leon Price, the head of our new audio editing team. But anyway, we'd planned to move on from this. And then apparently Sam had not been ignoring me and felt the need to call me out on Joe Rogan yesterday. And I think all of this is interesting in terms of social relationships as well, because we all constantly form theories about each other. And the question is, what data set does that theory about the person fit? And so if Sam has been narrowly focused on the particular data set of what he's seen on Twitter, then obviously I understand that his narrative of me makes sense. But if he'd seen the larger body of work that we'd be doing here on this show, interviewing these scientists, and with the Straight A Conspiracy and all of that, then he would understand that for a long time I've been trying to solve this problem of how do you diffuse innovations. And so I decided to try and, honestly learn from his playbook, because so much of how he's made a name for himself is getting in fights. And he's had a long, long litany of people that he's gotten in fights with. And then he successfully maintains his cool, and it seems like he's won to people who aren't necessarily familiar with the arguments. And there you go. And now he has said on record that I was wrong about the biology, which is what I wanted, because now we can just unpack the science and we can let the evidence decide for itself, which was always my goal.
And they said you were on the spectrum, which we can also probably have tested.
Well, it's interesting because I was thinking about this. The first thing is I'm definitely social media retarded, because a large part of it was that I tweeted Sam 400 times, but that's because I didn't understand netiquette. So I would cite tweets, which apparently is not a thing that you should do, and people got pissed off at me for that, so then I stopped doing that. And then I was constantly putting his Twitter handle in it because I thought that was what you were supposed to do, so that it was easily cross-referenced or something. Apparently that was stupid. So there were lots and lots of things that I did that were stupid. I may even be socially retarded. I'll take that. But I think it's just a really good demonstration of what I was trying to prove about what Sam's role is in these Christian communities, which is that he provides a very limited data set to a lot of people who don't have direct experience of scientists like Spiros, and therefore their entire stereotype of scientists is formed around this very litigious, tiny group, the new atheist people like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris. And so thank you for proving my point, Sam.
Whew, that was way more high-minded than I expected. I wanted to get in some burns.
Well, that's the point, is that's not really who I am by inclination. And if anybody wants to listen to the many, many episodes of this show, or if they want to read the Straight A Conspiracy, confrontation is not how I generally roll. And it was an experiment. And
I would like to say, though, that, Joe, on the show we just watched a little bit, right, with Sam, he defended you. He said, you're not like that. But what if Sam is not like that either, right? And that's his persona, just to get that point across, to get, to steer the pot, right? Because I have a feeling probably he's, very calm also, in real life. He thinks about stuff. Like everyone, you may have some opinions that are not as well researched, even though I have a feeling that's his life work these days, maybe just looking through stuff and, talking to so many people, getting different ideas. But I do think that, that we do need that empathy. right?
Well, and crucially, I mean, within the 400 tweets, and nobody should ever go through any of that or the 5,000 word posts that I was pumping out like one a day. The key idea that I was playing with is this idea that all the world's a stage, and that we all play different characters throughout our lives. And so throughout the course of that, I actually made a point to say, I am dealing with a character of Sam here, and a character of Richard Dawkins, and a character of Tom Woods, and a character of all these, and I offered them other characters. So at some point, I cast Richard Dawkins as my personal hero, because as a young boy, I was inspired by books like The Selfish Gene, and that was a lot of what drew me into the evolutionary biology. And so I said, I could make him that character. And I also offered Sam the opportunity to become the Marquis de Lafayette of the scientific Reformation, because rather than being with the Ancien Regime, he could turn his coat. And specifically, Joe, after our podcast, sent me a whole thing about Sam and Richard Dawkins, and they were talking about how the number one problem that Sam saw was the balkanization of science. Well, what does balkanization mean? It means splitting up into many parts. And what is mixed mental arts designed to do? Well, we're already, rather than talking about that problem, we're actively trying to solve it and putting it all into a cohesive worldview. But it's very understandable that Sam, rather than researching that or finding that out, just reacted emotionally to the thing that triggered him. But this was also part of my point, is that Descartes' error, which Cate has written such a beautiful knowledge bomb about, thinking and feeling are always linked. And that's true for Sam as well, because Sam is human. And Sam has consistently, if we want to talk about pictures that have been painted, Sam has consistently painted a picture with statistics of the Muslim world. And just as there's one view of Sam that I've provided, and I could provide others, Sam has consistently painted one view of the Muslim world that crucially does not fit with the view of the Muslim world that I have, having spent time there, or that Bryan Callen has, having spent time there, and is just not a very good reflection of what we know about human nature and the ways in which people blindly download culture from their environments, and that drives their choices. So Sam has done very well in the post-9/11 world selling this particular worldview. I personally think he's reached the end of the line with that sort of depiction of the Muslim world. And again, we'd moved on. I had a nice conversation with Walid Darab, who does a Muslim-themed podcast, and he's going to start doing a series of kintsugi posts around hadith, which are the sayings of the Prophet, just to show that wisdom is something that has existed in all societies and at all times, and we should focus on extracting the wisdom rather than just painting these ridiculous pictures of each other.
I'd like to say one of the things that I like about mixed mental arts is that, it's really about taking these two opposing ideas and being able to discern, okay, well, I was raised to feel this way, and my culture says I'm supposed to feel this way, but there is this opposing view. And can I hold both of them and see both sides? Can I walk in both shoes? And I think that's one of the things that really attracted me to mixed mental arts and being here with you guys.
I agree 100%. I was also going to say, what I think is so funny is, where are all the Lena Dunham fans, like supporters? It's all about Sam Harris, and it's basically the same thing. There's a lot of things about Lena Dunham's work that I really appreciate. The whole idea that banh mi or bad sushi is some kind of cultural appropriation is just ridiculous. And so it's all about having fun, and maybe at first you don't get the joke and it feels a little mean to be picked on, but it's also just come on, figure it out. It's just for fun. That's why you're being called names. We're all called names, and it's meant to knock us down a peg.
And crucially, I think what's important to recognize here is that I made a point to tease myself during the whole process. Because so much of how teasing works is it has to be reciprocal. It has to feel fair. And, for example, Nate, the Beltmaster McCabe, made up a great meme the other day of where he took, do you remember that terrible TV show, The Tick, where someone was a giant?
Not terrible.
Wasn't? Was it good?
It was good.
Oh, see, there you go. I stereotyped that TV show. I saw the graphic art and thought it was bad. But
it was ironic. It was very funny.
It was funny?
There was a Batman character named Die Fledermaus who was he was German, and it's just the bat, and the Wonder Woman was the something made. I think it was great.
I apologize to the creators and actors of this tick for defaming a beautiful show. But, he took that and then he put my face in because I have all these verbal tics. Or all those, the new atheists all made fun of me. And to Cate's point, in terms of that fairness, I made sure to call out a series of people. Lena Dunham, Richard B. Spencer from the alt-right, I called him Emo Kylo Ren. And, I experimented with all these different groups. I think what's interesting is that the people who are the most indignant and the most offended by this were not the social justice warriors. It was not the alt-right. The ANCAPers got pretty upset. But the ones who really got the most indignant and the most offended, it wasn't even the Dawkinsites. It was really the Sam Harris fans. They got so offended.
So what we've learned here is that you tend to antagonize virgins. And you guys are being really high-minded, but I'll just say this, and you can edit this out. Sam Harris is made of poop. Poop comes out of his mouth. He's all poop.
Would you like to elaborate on that perspective?
No, it's fair. I think I've made my whole point.
Well, I think this also brings up Sam's point, which is that he was saying that I was behaving in a very juvenile way, and juvenile was precisely the point. He thinks that's a bug, but it was actually a feature. Because specifically, what does it mean to have an experimental mind, a scientific mind? It means that you play with ideas. And the problem is that most people don't feel that they can play with ideas. There's this preciousness, there's this fear, there's this intimidation. And so part of it was to break down that fear and intimidation around these scientific ideas and have people on like Spiros who are relatable and can joke about wearing a Speedo. Or, for example, yesterday, Matt McDonough, whose nickname is the Unicorn, and Nicole Page, whose nickname is My Little Pony. So My Little Pony and the Unicorn made a meme of the holy trinity of cultural evolution. So you have the four horsemen of the non-apocalypse, supposedly the new atheists, and now as a counter to that, we have the holy trinity of cultural evolution, which is Jon Haidt as Jesus, David Sloan Wilson as God the Father, and Joe Henrich as the Holy Spirit. Now, what is the point of that? The point of that is to Dave, it's so
There's no Bryan Callen.
No, Bryan Callen is not in it. Everybody was like, oh, I thought you would be the fourth person.
That's offensive.
Yeah, that Bryan Callen is not in some sort of quasi-religious cult?
That we are not creating, he's got to be the figurehead. I think as we become more and more fundamentalists, we have to insist on the divinity of Bryan Callen.
Well, some people already are, but what I'm really excited about, and we already talked about this the last time, is that already within, 6 months of mixed mental arts forming, there is the groundwork for sectarian rifts. But I think that Sam didn't get the joke, and Sam and his followers take themselves very seriously. And part of my point was to reveal that that is not really what science is about. Science is not about being litigious, it's about being experimental. And you heard it here from Spiros Michalakis. You can look up Atul Gawande's excellent commencement speech. And Sam has said that I'm wrong about the biology. And the great thing about actually being a scientist is I don't care. I don't care if I'm wrong. That's not the point of science. The point of science is to develop better and better models and always to be in the search. And so this is great. Let's run with Sam's hypothesis. I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, well, then that means that even if you go to Harvard, you research for years and years and years 7 different fields of neuroscience and psychology to then write this book called The Straight A Conspiracy, and you interview 200 different scientists from a wide range of fields, that you still don't understand the biology. And that suggests a real problem for science, that is the current threshold and barrier to understanding these ideas, which only makes the work of mixed mental arts even more important to break down that material and make it accessible. And if Sam wants to, I offered to tutor Sam, because I know that he grew up in Brentwood, and this is, usually I tutor rich kids from Brentwood. And I would do that pro bono. I don't have but Sam's mom wrote The Golden Girls, which I'm very happy for him that he has that kind of trust fund. But I don't have that. But I would still, as Sam said yesterday, Mike Chernovich is out in the world. He's putting opinions out. Sam Harris is putting opinions out. He has 700,000 Twitter followers. And I think that it's important that an ambassador of science be representing science in a positive way. So either I will tutor Sam, or if Sam thinks I'm wrong about the biology, he can tutor me. I don't really care. What I care about is the science, and I care about the right ideas winning out. And fortunately, we have people like this here to break this down, and Cate Fogarty has taken my 5,000-word posts and digested them down to these 500-word knowledge bombs. And, Sam should just know that the clock is ticking. We are going to be moving this science of cultural evolution, whatever Sam Harris says. And at a certain point, people will come to realize who is wrong about intuitionism and versus rationalism, and who is wrong about multi-level selection, and what does the diffusion of innovations actually add up to, and how will the people feel when they've realized there's all this great science that is just piled up and hasn't been moving into the public's heads.
I really like that you talked about the diffusion of innovations, because that's really, at the end of the day, what this is all about. It's about, I think you said it, it was the Thunderdome, the idea Thunderdome of coming together and saying, hey, here's my idea about the world. I may be right. I may not be right. I have to be open to not being right, but I'm going to stand before everyone. I'm going to give you my point of view, and whatever it is, the best idea is going to stay, and, the lesser idea is going to be phased out over time.
And the crucial thing there is that you're not wrapping your ego up in this whole process, because ideas are merely tools that we use to make sense of and break down the world. And therefore, it ultimately doesn't matter to me whether I am in this moment right or wrong. I'm more interested in evolving forward.
Well, that's the thing. That's the reason that I keep the post so short, 500 words. So if I can't explain it to you in 500 words, then I don't really understand it. And then also, if there's a mistake, if I have to change it, it takes me less time. 500 words, I don't have to do, on and on and on. And also, I don't know a lot about Sam Harris, but I watched that clip of him, and the thing that stood out to me so much was that you're a nobody. These other people are nobodies. There's certain people that are somebodies on Twitter. You can't tell on Twitter. And to me, that's everybody needs to understand science. That's how we move forward. It's not just the people that can afford to go to college or Harvard or wherever it is. It's everybody, even the people on Twitter. Yesterday, I reached out to this professor on Twitter, and she wrote me back, responded immediately to my question. It wasn't like, oh, you're not somebody. I just had a simple question that I probably could have Googled, to be honest, but she just responded, and she was nice about it, and now I know and I can move forward. And I feel like that's part of what we're doing, and if we make mistakes along the way, if we hurt somebody's feelings along the way, well, we will apologize, but we'll keep moving forward and let everybody in on this conversation.
No, that's great. I just wanted to appreciate there was some shade thrown earlier by Hunter that was underneath it, and I wanted to point out that's some quality shade. Yeah. Golden Girls shade. Come on.
Well, but I think that's what's so funny is that there's the same thing with Peter Schiff or Thomas Woods or any of these people who are out there. And part of this is, how has social media been used up until now? And things that are emotionally provocative and simple have done well. Kim Kardashian's greasy butt is not something that requires a lot of thought. It taps into our most primal instincts. And in the same way, anarcho-capitalism is this very simple message of the government is bad. We just have to get rid of government, and then the free market will solve everything. Or Sam Harris's narratives, which essentially attribute all the problems of the world to religion, and that's an easy narrative to carve out. And so the challenge is that there are a lot of ideas, and this is part of what's happened, is I created this social drama with these various people, and then they've come in and they've been like, what is this beef all about? I don't understand it. And then it's my challenge to break it down more simply. Now, I am apparently not good at that, which is why we have Cate Fogarty and other people who, Nate McCabe is now writing songs about this, and we're doing all sorts of things that are going to make these ideas more and more accessible. But the basic idea is, and this all came out of the science too, it comes out of Joe Henrich's The Secret of Our Success, because what humans are off the charts good at is tracking social drama. So we track social drama, and then we come in to figure out what is this conflict about. And then when we come in to figure out what the conflict is about, that's when we unpack the ideas and we come to understand it. And crucially, I just think it's hilariously funny that The Golden Girls is a great show. Yeah. It's one of my all-time favorite shows.
I'm going to say this real quick, and then I got another question for him. I know now, I found out that the Golden Girls is on Netflix. I know 4 different people who just like when they have some time to kill, they go on Netflix and watch the Golden Girls. Like you could watch anything on Netflix and they're still watching reruns of the Golden Girls.
Fantastic show.
It's a fantastic
One
show.
of the best shows ever done. Not as good as... Is it as good as The Tick, or is The Tick...
The Tick was fine. It's nerdy. It's funny, but it's nerdy.
But it's not the Golden Girls.
No. It had a... Oh, God, I can't... Patrick Warburton played The Tick.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say one more quick thing. I mean, it's too bad that Sam Harris doesn't maybe value religion more, because, of course, there's the idea that you hate the sin, love the sinner. And it's like, same thing with Lena Dunham. It's like, we can love Lena Dunham, but hate this thing that she tried to put forth or whatever about food. Same thing with Sam Harris. Same thing with me. Same thing with Hunter. It's like Hunter said, Fijian fish taboos one time. And I had no idea what he was talking about. And then all of a sudden I realized he was saying fish taboos. I still love him.
That's very kind of you, Cate. I mean, that's a level of Christian forgiveness that I don't think any human should be asked to demonstrate. But I'm glad that you brought that up, because for me, the place that I really learned to separate out my self-worth from my ideas was actually from tutoring at Oaks Christian. And it was that idea of love the sinner, hate the sin. And I think that's an incredibly valuable idea. And the point is that I don't know that Sam necessarily understands that idea. Because if he did, then he would be a scientist, and he would be like Spiros, and he would be like Atul Gawande, and he would be the way that I have come to understand science, which is that ideas rise and fall, but that has nothing to do with your self-worth.
Can I suggest that instead of love the sinner, hate the sin, we have love the sinner, understand the sin?
Oh, shit.
I would much rather have empathy, right, than just because, again, hating something means you have made a judgment, litigiousness, as you were saying earlier, right? So, whether it is from Christianity or Islam or science or politics, left versus right, all that stuff, I mean, it seems like the most, I guess, unemotional way, detached way to put it is that it is inefficient. Right? It is as if like you're not looking for the answer, you're looking to be correct, right? You have often a very impulsive reaction to something, whatever it may be that you don't like. It could be bugs, it could be spiders, right? And we it happens to other humans too, right? They don't look the right way, they don't think the way we want them to think, right? And all that stuff. And all of a sudden we are immediately repulsed. And then we try to say to ourselves that no, we are not bad people that are like close-minded and all that stuff. No, I will love you, but not really who you are and what you stand for, right? I don't get that, because to me the two are pretty much the same, right? We're made of the same wetware. So what distinguishes us is really some of our ideas, some of our beliefs, right? These dynamic processes happening in our heads, and as we change as human beings. I would much rather, I could say I hate, right, general relativity, because I love quantum physics and it doesn't gel with each other, right? So I make a choice. Like, I don't like general relativity. I don't care about Einstein and all that stuff. I mean, that would be kind of BS. I'd be like, no, I love Einstein. I think he was a great guy. He has great hair and everything. But his idea, it's all good and everything, but he was missing something, right? I'm like, no, I'd rather understand it. He probably had something very deep I'm not even like getting where he was coming from, right? And I need to be in his shoes before I can even really hate the idea. It's a high compliment, I think, to really like go to the, through the motions and everything until you can truly hate, despise an idea. You really have to spend some time and effort, right?
Wow.
And I think that's great. And I think crucially this also gets down to what the ancients knew about the human mind and what science has now reconfirmed and clarified, which is that there's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. So the second that you choose to hate something or to love something, you are instantly setting up your mind to distort it so that you can't see it clearly. So I think that's a great yes and of what Cate is saying and what the Christians are saying. Love the sinner, understand the sin. And I think that's the thing. It's not hard for me to understand Sam Harris. Sam Harris grew up in Brentwood. He had a particular experience. He comes from a very particular culture, crucially the culture that's known in the research as the weird culture, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. That's Joe Henrich's work, who is part of the Holy Trinity. And that culture has certain values. They prize statistics. There's a lot of focus on dignity rather than an honor culture. And he sees things in the world that upset him and that appall him and that no one is speaking out about. And so he's doing that. And in the same way, I see things in the world that upset me and that appall me, and so that I'm speaking out about. And so it's the easiest thing in the world for me to understand Sam Harris. And I again, like if I'd had, I think that's the so much of the power of this cultural evolution research is that it just makes abundantly clear that if you were born into those circumstances, you would be behaving the same way. So at no point am I in a position to fundamentally judge anybody, but that doesn't mean that I just find Katie O'Brien's analogy of what this moment in history of is humanity's first family dinner. And the conversation is not going well. And we need to begin to turn the conversation. And part of that is recognizing what has been happening in these first years of social media is that there are certain people who are speaking very loudly in very simple messages, and that they are creating an incredibly unproductive conversation. And the great thing is that those of us who have sort of remained quiet as this shouting match has gone on can now come together, and we can have conversations like this. We can put them out there, and if people are more interested in this kind of conversation, they can come to this. And ultimately, all social power comes from the group. So if everybody starts wandering away from those figures and starts setting up more and more of their own conversations like this and starts to get more and more on that path of searching for answers, then they lose all social power and they will have to change their game. And so Sam, for example, said, how does he expect me to, does he expect that he's going to get a debate with me by doing this? And I haven't wanted a debate with Sam at any point. I would rather have a conversation. But also, it's very funny to me the degree to which his followers think that is the be-all and end-all, that the greatest honor that a man could get in life is to debate Sam Harris.
Can I just say, how many debates have changed anything ever? Like, how many internet debates have you seen that aren't just there for you to just that's my favorite thing about it. It's like, I dare you to debate me. Because what? No one will watch and no one will care? No matter who wins?
Well, but I think that is important because you're right. The reason why it doesn't work is not because the debate even doesn't have value. Very often it can have a lot of value, right? Just like a podcast can have a lot of value. New ideas come in like you haven't heard before. It is whether you're receptive enough, you're in the right emotional and mental state to evaluate these things and say, okay, is this actually, important? Is this something I should invest some more time in, right? And to be honest, listening to all of this, right, I feel that we're doing exactly what we're saying we don't want other people to do. We are judging. The moment you say, love the sin or hate the sin, you've defined something as a sin. Who are you to define something as a sin? It's not even understanding the sin. It's okay, I will say Hunter, I love you, right? Even though you're an asshole, okay?
This is true.
Well, no, you're not. But if when I say that, immediately you're like, wait a minute, what did you mean you love me, right? Where you care about me or something like that, right? Immediately you've made a decision of who I am, and usually without even knowing who I am, right? Just because I'm a caricature of myself, just like in quantum physics, as we said, you have just a representation, a very low-dimensional representation of objects, and then as humans, we cannot do much better usually, right? Unless we go exploring more and more, doing science, talking to people, connecting with them beyond the superficial, right? Trying to explore different dimensions of that same human being. Because the moment you say that you know Sam Harris, right? If you were to say that on another podcast about you, oh, I know Hunter too. I know exactly, he went to Harvard, he did this, he did that, right? And you're like, wait a minute, no, that's not who I am. Sure, there's some approximation, but there's so many other experiences that have molded me, right? And even like behind closed doors, you may say like, no, I don't really like, I'm trying to do this. I have this like passion. I care about this. And I found this like, for me, one of my best friends is someone who voted for Donald Trump because he cared so much about like, something that Hillary Clinton was opposing, right? He's one of my closest friends, okay? And I cannot find anything I disagree on with this man, but the fact that he voted for Donald Trump. Like, personally, like I have other reasons why I would never do such a thing, but I cannot like, I'm like, how is this possible? We agree pretty much on everything, and I go deep. Like, I don't just try to be like, okay, yeah, we'll agree to disagree. And we're coming from the same place, right? And there's few, things I would like change here and there if I were him, right? Like a sense of loyalty he has that goes beyond what I think is like, appropriate. It's like, selfless altruism potentially that goes beyond. And these are sometimes the heroes that become the villain, right? Because it becomes amplified, right? These from the greatest things, some of the worst things have come because you try to eradicate, right, evil. But who decides what evil is, right? How, without understanding it, right? Even labeling it as evil, you're predisposed to be like defensive, to only ask the right questions, so to, according to what you're thinking. But from their side, whatever the evil side is, right? Whether it is like, Sam Harris's followers or Sam Harris himself, there is no discontinuity in the universe. There was no point where they're like, and now I will start being unreasonable, There was no such thing. It just evolved beautifully in their minds, like as a collective, just like your followers, right? And it is a matter of understanding through empathy sometimes, because you cannot sympathize, right, if you're that far away. What is it, right? How do we look to them from their point of view? What is wrong with us? If you can understand that, I think that's a much better way to understand them, right, than, from your point of view, saying what is wrong with them. That's usually very hard to do, but, with the more experiences you have going out into the world, talking to other people that don't think like you, right, that like you want to hate, but then they're right in front of you, and you cannot just hate. You cannot, if Sam was here, we would be having a very different conversation.
Yeah, of course.
Right? And you'd be like asking questions. You'd be like, okay, I see, but what about that? And you said this. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait a minute. Oh, okay, we agree. And it's like, that's weird. How is that possible?
Well, but it's the easiest thing in the world. I mean, we did over 200 podcasts where we agreed with everyone, including a bunch of anarcho-capitalists. And we focused on the things that we agreed on. And it's the easiest thing in the world. We do this with our relatives all the time. We avoid the elephants in the room, and we specifically only talk about the things that are points of agreement, whether it's in Kansas City, you talk about barbecue. In many cities, you talk about sports. Or, if you're of the same political affiliation, you talk about that, or books you love, or whatever it may be. It's very easy to have a pleasant conversation with literally anyone.
Yeah, but what I mean is like the conversation I've had with my, good friend, right, who is on paper orthogonal to me, right, or like even worse, like completely opposite, right? The amazing thing is that we had the difficult conversations over dinner. We were not just like, being pleasant or not talking about this or that. Like it was all on the table. And even after that, we realized we didn't actually disagree on anything. It was just like we started pretty much from the same point and just took divergent paths. It was almost at the beginning, right? It was like an equation that is chaotic. You start from the same initial condition plus a little something different on one side, and you end up completely like on the other side of the world, right? But your core is still the same. And even though you try to go back in time to be like, why did I make that decision? Why did I care so much about that? How did I color my opinion because of this other state I was in, right? Very often we're like, automata in some ways, okay? Relative to where we're standing right now and how we feel about the world, we make decisions that may be completely inappropriate relative to like where we started from, what our core values really are, right?
Well, I think also your environment that you're raised in informs your behavior. It informs, your ideas. It informs the way that you think. And, the way that we think of environment sometimes is not the whole environment. We think of environment as like, well, he's from Brentwood and he's, went to this school and his mom's a successful writer, and but that, like you said, environment is so much more than that. You can have the rest of your life shaped by, for instance, my brother has a friend who unfortunately broke his back in a snowboarding accident, and they were really close. And my brother, now what he studies is spinal cord injury repair. So that one little incident in his environment actually shaped a large portion of his life.
That's amazing, yeah.
I think bringing it full circle, too, when you're talking about you and your friend, I find that most of the time when somebody I'm like, why do we disagree so much? You and me are on the same page on almost everything. It almost always comes down to the axioms you were talking about. There's something that I have agreed, that I or they believe is true, that the other one does not agree, and that we believe it's self-evident.
Yeah.
So, I think that's, in politics, you see a lot of fights between Trump supporters and Hillary, and, but you also saw a huge rift between Hillary and Bernie supporters, and there's some really solid basic things that are just decided upon and self-evident, and there's nothing you can do about it.
And it is difficult, and I think it's important that it is difficult, because sometimes, to go back to Sam Harris, right, his love of statistics, as you're saying, sometimes all you have is statistics. You're stuck sometimes,
That's
right?
That's not all you have, though.
I mean, from a point of view of when you're trying to make policy in real time, you may not have the wisdom or the time even to look at everything. Right.
But I think that's part of the problem of how policy and politics are done. Crucially, I mean, Hillary Clinton is also weird. She's one of the weirdest humans who has ever lived. And the problem is that 10,000-foot view reveals certain things, but it means that you miss out on other things. I would say, ironically, sort of Donald Trump is probably the exact opposite. He's all the 3-foot view. He's there on the ground, he's meeting people, and he's very good at storytelling that fits with the level of understanding that the voters he's trying to target reach. Yeah. So I think the point is that the truth is emergent from switching many, many, many different perspectives. That's why, again, one of the things that I made a point to use was the hero has 1,000 faces. So, for example, I don't have any option but to tell stories about Spiros, right? Even when I say this guy's name is Spiros, I've told a story. And then when I say he's a quantum physicist, I've told a story. And I've limited him in some way. I've truncated and I've renormalized. The same thing with Greek. But this is the realities, and this is in terms of core axioms that I operate from, is that there are practical realities of how the human mind works and what the human mind can handle. And in the same way, you have to be aware that if you are consistently telling a story about Muslims or about religion or about Christians, and you're telling a story about science, that ends up becoming a dominant narrative. And the point was to disrupt that narrative and say there are other narratives, like the one that Cate is talking about, where we can say, oh, look, love the sinner and understand the sin, and that's a different narrative. And we can see, oh, actually here, scientists and Christians have common grounds in terms of, or the potential for common grounds in terms of the pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of truth. And part of the other thing is that you have Jon Haidt's book, The Happiness Hypothesis, which shows all the way in which science has rediscovered what Jesus already knew about the brain and what the Buddha already knew about the brain and what people like Ben Franklin knew about the human condition. And so instead of having a conversation that starts from the ways in which we are disagreeing with religious people, we can start from a conversation about what we have in common. And then we can start to build a bridge between those communities, and then we can start to get into, once we've built that trust, all of those apparently more difficult conversations around evolution. In practice, those conversations are not more difficult because they become emotionally charged. But crucially, capitalism is evolution. Most Christians already believe in evolution. The free market is an evolutionary process. And the issue is, do you extend that evolutionary process up to the level of culture and group selection, as David Sloan Wilson does, and as Richard Dawkins refuses to do? Or do you extend it down to the level of the gene, as Christian fundamentalists refuse to do? And so the issue is not, do people believe in evolution? Almost every human on the planet believes in evolution, which is just change over time in responses to environment and forces. How far do you extend it, and how many playing fields do you think it's happening on? And so my goal here, Spiros, is, and I think that it's awesome that you are making sure that we're being fair to Sam. And Sam
I don't know Sam, to be honest. It's more like about, I love the idea of the mixed mental arts and this like, you know, diffusion of innovation. But, you know, I want us to be careful from one point of view, which is that this is a dynamic process, right?
100%.
Which is very important. What you said is very correct, that, you know, there have to be practical limitations. That's actually what I meant by, like, sometimes when you're doing policy making or talking, like, about some important issues in real time, you may not have the time to tell, like, you know, every story that you know of that paints with each orthogonal story, right, a different dimension of the problem. So the people can understand that, like, oh, the caricatures they have, right, of, like, you know, pro-choice versus pro-life, like, you know, homosexuality, all these things is like, there are so many dimensions that once you start exploring them, you're like, you have a very different even point of view of what's happening.
Yep.
But something that I am worried about, right, and I see also as scientists making, I think, that mistake, is that sometimes we are so married to the truth right now that whatever that picture is, whatever the science is, right, ends up creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that is a big mistake. From what point of view, right? Say that we find, all right, this is going to be kind of controversial, but say that we find, after we do a lot of research or something like that, that African Americans, like, you know, do not have whatever, like, you know, standard of intelligence that, like, white people came up with, right? And it's across the board, and it's like 99%, like, you know, plus or minus, whatever. What does it even mean? Like, why do I even care? That means that it's kind of like me getting a student, right, who did not, like, ace their SATs, right? And then I say, well, you know, you're not going to amount to much. That's not their fault. That's my fault as their mentor, right? If I don't have the power, the strength within me to unlock their true potential, right, then all I've given them is just an assessment test of where are you right now, not what your potential is, right? I will put you in this box and I will say, like, this is who you are right now. And I would actually be correct at that moment in time, right? And a lot of kids, before they go to college, they feel that pressure, right? From their teachers, from their parents. They're like, I'm not good enough, right? We hear these stories that we revere for some weird reason, right? You know, they're like, oh yes, Einstein was, like, you know, terrible at math or whatever. That's probably not true. There's probably lazy or whatever. But Stephen Hawking, the same thing. You know, we love this underdog of, oh, they weren't good, but now they're amazing. But at the same time, we don't really care much about people like that. When we see them, we're like, yeah, you can't be of much help to me right now. You're not going to be successful. I don't have the time or even the knowledge, right? And the empathy, that's the worst part, right? The empathy to see you as somebody who can surpass me, right? Somebody I think of myself as successful, but if I'm truly successful, you will be more successful than me. That's the greatest tribute to a mentor and a teacher, right? So I want us to make sure that we see the best in others. That's why I mean, like, understanding others to me is important, because you create a better world. You don't just take a snapshot that says that's what the world is, those are the problems, right? As you said before, those are not bugs, those are features. We just haven't found a way to use them right now. And yes, indeed, in cultures, there are some things that are like, you know, they work better than other things. But it's almost like without us even trying, because as you said, evolution, right, you know, takes over time, the things that are not as successful, they kind of die out, right? As ideas, as whatever it is, they just slowly die out. Try to cling to power, like, you know, to create this universe where they can, the environment where they can still thrive. But there is, like, this dynamic process that happens, right? You know, that selects, almost self-selects in some ways. And sometimes you have to go against it, because it could be, right, you know, that because of our environment, only certain types of people, like, end up surviving, right? Or, like, thriving. And it's a very difficult question. At which point do you have a welfare? Right? That's, I think, one of the big questions, okay? At which point do you have the Ayn Rand people that say, Atlas Shrugged, and I'm John Galt? And when I was reading that book, I was like, this is about me, until the end. And I was like, wait a minute, I felt something was missing at the end. And I'm like, what is that? It was that empathy. It was that empathy that, like, every now and then would be part of the book itself, actually. Like, some beautiful story about, like, Hank Riordan, the great tycoon, like, you know, and all that stuff, and a little kid that you would, like, you know, but he wept over the kid that like was looking up to him, right? The one was supposed to be just like a throwaway or something. But this bigger idea that either you are with us because you're gifted and you're amazing, right? And now whether you come like from this background or that background, we have identified the property of you that we love, you're one of us. The problem is when we don't identify people with that particular property, whether they're poor, rich, like, black, white, whatever it is, and we say, no, sorry, that it's because, and it's not because we're wrong or something like that, it's because we're human beings, and we're like, we don't know how to teach you, how to mentor you, and more importantly, how to learn from you. We don't think you have something to add, right? If we did, you would be like coming over all the time, like we're having dinners, we're having a great time, and we feel like we're resonating, right? If you're off phase with someone, it's so much more difficult to connect, but that's what we need to do if we're actually ever going to come together. It's not going to happen, right? By saying like, well, yes, we have the right ideas, you have to come over and get them.
Well, and crucially, that is in terms of fundamental axioms of mixed mental arts, at least for me, the first most important axiom is that I do not define mixed mental arts because it's going to be defined by the intellectual Thunderdome, and ideas will compete and they will, win out. And that's why, like Bryan, I'm so excited to have Salon, where we can have a diversity of voices saying different things. But for me, one of the core axioms is this idea that humanity's superpower is social intelligence. And the wisdom is emergent from the crowd, and it is emergent from different competing perspectives. And that as we test each other, we have these undoing projects, like Michael Lewis writes about in terms of Kahneman and Tversky, where we're all unpacking each other's thinking and engaging in slow thinking and reflection. And the goal is to essentially evolve society towards a stage where we understand that diversity of thought, disagreement, people coming from different cultural perspectives is actually a huge asset. It's the basis of innovation. It's the basis of our collective progress. So, but the challenge is that the current situation is that there are these echo chambers, and these echo chambers are gathered around certain individuals who have built their power in a particular way, and those echo chambers need to be disrupted in order to free up the energy to start to get those conversations happening across tribal lines. And so my experiment was a desire to start to break up some of those echo chambers and crucially reduce the power around those individuals. So much of this is that there's, in terms of being juvenile, I'm a big fan of there's a masterwork by a Japanese author known as Everyone Poops. It's a really great book. I strongly recommend it.
The whole series, yeah.
Yeah. But the reason why I think that book is so brilliant is because nothing removes awe like the fact that somebody poops. This is why Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong-il put about this myth that they have never pooped. That's what they claim, and that's the ultimate in trying to separate yourself out from the rest of humanity and acting like you're better than everybody and that you're a big fish and everybody else is stupid and small. And so having that idea of everyone poops is basically there to constantly strip away awe, because awe is the problem. Awe is great. I mean, I shouldn't say it's the problem, to be fair. Emotions are neither good or bad, but they are appropriate and helpful and constructive, or they are inappropriate and destructive. So it is appropriate for me to have awe when I go and do kickboxing class towards the people who are the teacher and who are much better than me, because that's a way to quickly blind copy a lot of information from them. So when I go into kickboxing class, I make sure to be super grateful, to be super thankful, to, try and learn everything I can, and to constantly humble myself and self-deprecate. And that's an intentional use of putting myself in a position of humility to then have them in a position of awe so that I can transfer information as quickly as possible. But awe can also be very problematic in terms of these figures like pharaohs and celebrities and emperors and dictators. And I think it's a big problem in academia because there's a certain amount of awe for the ivory tower and for some of the founding figures of these disciplines. And what happens then is they no longer become intellectually accountable. And so my goal with all of this was to start to break down and destroy some of that all so that we could get to the intellectual Thunderdome and really be challenging the ideas on their own merits rather than getting all caught up in how we feel about not even the individual, because the real individual is something totally separate, but this image of the individual that the person is being built up about themselves. And that's why I've been calling myself Toto, because Toto, the little dog who is low and humble, pulls back the curtain on the wizard and reveals that it's just a man.
And also that's one thing that I wanted to point out too when you were talking about like the wide view versus the narrow view. It's like we can all have a narrow view of people, and then we get down to that level and we do, I think, agree more than we disagree. But the wider view, sometimes we just have to disagree. We have to move forward, and luckily it's not up to just one person. It's about the force of the crowd, like Hunter was saying. And so, yeah, of course, it's like if Sam were here, we would have a very different conversation, and I think it would be really useful too, because it would break that echo chamber. Instead of just talking shit in each of our corners of the mat, we'd actually be getting into it and discussing things and changing each other's minds as well as the people listening. And that's kind of the whole point.
But we should be,
get there. I mean,
yeah, we should be able to do that even without Sam here. Otherwise, why are we even talking about this, right? We're not going to change any of, his followers' minds or his mind on anything if we're only doing that when he's here. And that's very difficult often because, if you have a caricature of somebody, you attack a straw man or whatever it is, or even a position that you're correct about, but that's usually the worst, right? When you corner somebody, that's when they become defensive and they start really, right, becoming entrenched in their ideas.
Well,
it's an emotional battle. It's not an intellectual battle. It has never been an intellectual battle. Never, right? It is only an intellectual battle when there is a reason. I mean, if it was an intellectual battle, I would be like one of the more famous people in the world, like, reading my theorems and all that stuff. I'd be like, wow, this is really interesting. Let me read that page. And let me, nobody cares until it is like big enough or something that like the New York Times is going to write about and it's popular, right? That's when people care. Why don't people we know even less about quantum physics, right? In a very real sense than we know about the climate. Why do people care so much, right, about the scientists that are working on the climate? On one side or the other side, whatever it is, right? And even if most of them are agreeing, you can say, no, it's still controversial. Like in quantum physics, we don't even have 97% agreement. We have 30% agreement here, 20% agreement on that, the interpretations of what quantum physics is, the very many different ones, right? But nobody gives a shit. It's because emotionally, it doesn't matter to them, right? If the next day it became important because depending on what faction of physics, right, of quantum physics you subscribe to, you would literally either make millions or not, right? Or you'd be really cool or not, okay, and so on and so forth. Then you would say yes, it would be insane, okay? Right now, this is just in the corners of the internet of the nerd world, right? Where you have maybe on Reddit or something where you have conversations happening about, oh yes, the Copenhagen interpretation is so silly. The many worlds is the right one and all that stuff. Most people don't even care. But all of a sudden, climate change, which they understand even less about potentially, but that is so important, they are wrong, right? The people become experts who are not experts.
Well, and crucially, so we talked about this last time, Adrian Bayan, who wrote The Physics of Life, he basically, summed up in one sentence the diffusion of innovations by Everett Rogers, or at least a large part of it, which is that people care about science when it's practical or when it has some relevance for their lives. And obviously climate science, if the world is about to, die in some sort of apocalypse, doesn't get much more relevant than that. And the problem,
or if their job depends on
exactly,
that is going to be okay no matter what. I mean, it has come to a point. I'm saying this just to clarify this idea that it doesn't even matter in the end. Even if somebody like me says, I'm not a climate scientist, right? So I don't know. I just believe, through secondhand even knowledge that yes, most of it, people agree about it according to the models that they have now. And maybe these models are wrong, right? But if they are not, if these models are not wrong, and there is something we can do, right? we should probably try to do it, find creative ways to do it while maintaining like other things, right? And even if there's nothing we can do, they're like, oh, we don't care. We'll just continue because that's what we know how to do. We'll continue doing what we're doing. Even though we all die in a few generations, it's going to be okay. There's nothing, it's not, and it makes sense. As a human being, you don't care when it really comes down to it, when you're in pain, right? You're not being philosophical or altruistic or empathetic when you're like, your mother is doing drugs, your father has left 20 years ago, right? You're almost alcoholic and you're trying to go from one day to the next day. You're not going to care like, oh yeah, what about 3 generations from now? I want to think about what they're going to be going through. You just don't care. You're just trying to survive, to keep yourself afloat. It's not an intellectual argument that it will win you over.
And that's really the point of mixed mental arts, is to make all of this content emotional. And that's what we've been trying to do. And the point is that I threw up some weather balloons. I tried out a whole bunch of people like Lena Dunham, Richard B. Spencer. And the one that really resonated apparently, and it's not a surprise given the Joe Rogan community and how many times Joe has had Sam on, and that Joe has a strong relationship with him, so that he and I, Joe and I had a great conversation for the first 3 hours, and then the Sam Harris conversation happened, and it went south. And Joe has his experience of it, which is that he pushed me and challenged me, and I made no sense. That certainly wasn't my experience. I mean, coming from me, I, for a long time, had been waiting for the opportunity to get on Joe's show and to get these ideas out there. And part of why I was so nervous on there and had so many verbal tics and was throwing out citations in an aggressive way was because I wanted to move these ideas. That has become, I've been trying to solve a problem for my entire life in terms of how do you raise the living standards of people all over the world. And this was sort of the next logical step. And did I screw up that opportunity? Perhaps. Let's say I did or say I didn't.
Publicity is bad publicity.
Yeah, and that's my point.
I know, right?
See, Bryan, that's what's interesting is Bryan is like, you burned that bridge. But I don't think that publicity is bad publicity, because to me it's not problematic. Like, I now have multiple roles in different parts of the internet. Here within the mixed mental arts community, you guys may think I'm socially retarded, but you at least understand my perspective well enough to understand that I'm a well-meaning social retard. And then there's this totally different story that has emerged in the Sam Harris forums, and I went into the subreddit and tried to have a very nice conversation and engage them with some of these articles. They called me some names, which I'm totally fine with. And let's say that I deserve those names. But to me, that's not bad, because what it comes down to is teaching. And it's all an opportunity to demonstrate the way that we form stories about other people based on whatever information that we're running off of. And that's exactly the problem that I've been trying to draw attention to. And again, like, I don't care. Like, if what comes out of this is that, I become a toxic liability of an asset to the mixed mental arts community, and they have to publicly denounce me, and then Cate Fogarty is the new empress.
That was a long game.
She has been behind this the whole time.
Yeah.
Kate, I can see this. This is brilliant.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I want to throw in one thing in between all this that I think is also super important, is that as we're talking about, like, okay, so let's use Sam Harris for an example, or Trump and Hillary, or whatever example you want to use of different organizations. The truth of the matter is also, most people don't care or have an opinion about these things. And when we talk about, like, when you look at Trump, the election, most people did not, maybe not most, but close to most people didn't vote. More people didn't vote than voted for any candidate that was in the thing. I've talked to several people about this thing with you and Sam, and when I say his name, most people I know go, who's that? I don't think I've heard of that person. And so as serious as it may feel on a subreddit, as important as it may feel to somebody who is convinced that religion is the problem, I think the biggest thing about this movement is, if you're going to make it, is coming up with compelling stories and then giving it to people who don't give a shit yet.
Yeah.
The thing about climate science is, like, climate change, really what we need to do is reach it out to people who don't have an opinion, people who don't give a shit, and get them to get that story in. Because you're right. What we really care about is what's around us and what's affecting us. And if I can find a way to make somebody care about this, and that's why I think, we talked a while, and not to get political about it, but like, that if the stories about Trump and P didn't do a ton for him. But if the pictures came out, that would create a story that everybody would care about.
Are you talking about Golden Girls?
Yeah, the Golden Girls thing.
We always come back to that show. So.
I think the internet just had an idea.
But yeah, I mean,
Golden shower girls.
Coming back to that, if we see that and develop that story, look, he got peed on, I saw it, a lot of people are going to care who don't care now. And it's kind of great and also kind of terrible because there is that point of like, well, what is it going to make people care about climate change? And it's sort of sad if what it turns out to be is, poop or something.
Well, but I think we have to design for humans as they really are. That's my key thing. And so much of my thinking on all of this has, been shaped by the science, but also looking, for example, at this book that I've referenced before, The Bully Pulpit by Doris Kearns Goodwin, which is all about Teddy Roosevelt, Ida Tarbell, and the muckrakers and what they did in the progressive era. And the key thing, there are a lot of important lessons, but one of the most important lessons is that the reporters at McClure's understood that people could not track the problem of monopolies or the problem of trust because it was too large and too abstract. So they said, let's pick one. And we're just going to pick that and we're going to follow that story to the end of the line as a way of making the problem concrete for people. And then once they've understood the concrete specific example, then they can generalize and understand the general problem of monopolies and trust. And so my goal in terms of, I was looking at, okay, everybody's talking about Muslim fundamentalism, but I see a lot of the same psychology in the West. And so my goal was to give concrete examples and then to follow them and to unpack them so that people could concretely grab onto how does this actually work. And again, I put up many weather balloons, and it turns out that one of them, I did my experiment, and then Sam was kind enough to give us some results yesterday. And as a scientist, I thank him for that. But the key thing is that if you look within his community, you actually get a really good sense of what's going on in the Muslim world, where there's a huge spectrum of people. And there are people who like Sam's show a lot, who I have great conversations with and I totally respect, and they listen to him and they find lots and lots of value there, and they are able to, they use the wisdom to know the difference, and they pick out the things they like and they pick out the things they don't. There are some people who go out and troll for Sam because they think it's funny, and it's really mostly about them trying to amuse themselves or make fun of people, and so it's just entertainment. And then there are some really diehard people. And again, to understand where those people are coming from, very often having engaged them now on Twitter, which was the point, was to have those sorts of conversations, many of them are coming from some sort of religious trauma where they may have been sexually abused by a priest, or they may have had some really, really hard experience, and the way they're making sense of that is to blame that on God, on religion. And I can't fault them for that. I understand that. I didn't have to go through that trauma. I did have a Catholic priest who asked me all sorts of inappropriate questions in confession. But at the time, I didn't think much of it. So I understand where these people are coming from. But I think what's also really important about the bully pulpit as an example is that it's what scale are you trying to operate on? And Teddy Roosevelt was looking at the nation as a whole, that system, and that at that level, corruption was problematic. But that meant that in the process, he had to use certain people who were engaged in corruption as an example. He pissed off those special interests. They turned against him. And that's the point, is that there's no one level that you're going to operate on that is good for everyone. And of course, you could go and talk to the people who Teddy Roosevelt busted up, and they would have great stories to tell about how everybody was doing it. They had to make a living. If they didn't do this, they wouldn't be able to support their family. And that would be a totally understandable perspective from a human level. But that doesn't mean that that behavior isn't systemically problematic. And that's the point here, is that my focus is that conversation of humanity's first family dinner and how do you make that work. And I understand that in calling certain people out, I am going to piss off certain members of the family, but my goal is to then create more and more of a community that is having that reasonable conversation to figure things out so that we can then go and talk to those people who have some trauma very often or have something that's going on with them and help talk them through it.
Well, religion has set forth many bad ideas over the millennia, and Sam Harris is aggressively trying to get those bad ideas, dissolved. And so that is kind of something in the spirit of what we're doing as well, to try to diffuse the bad ideas. Religion certainly has a lot of them, but I think that what I'm getting is that the thing that you have a problem with is that Sam is coming at it from a fundamentalist approach, saying, well, this is the way and this is correct and I am the way. Not here's a bridge, let's let the group decide.
Well, and I mean, crucially, there's been such a litany of people that have disagreed or taken issue with Sam Harris. I mean, it's now a very, very, very long list. And the clip that you saw, I mean, they talked about Andy Kindler, they talked about Mike Chernovich, they talked about, I think, Abby Martin, there was Reza Aslan, there was Ben Affleck, Glenn Greenwald, him and Hannibal Buress had a thing. And I didn't know about most of these things. Jon Haidt, who I massively respect, also had a thing with Sam Harris because Sam Harris, I think Jon Haidt's issue with Sam Harris is probably the one that's closest to mine, in the sense that his issue was that Sam Harris was so lawyerly and so litigious, and that isn't really the scientific approach to things, and that also fundamentally Sam is out of line with what the science says about how the brain works. But I think what's interesting, and I think Joe's great, and I think, by the way, Joe is 100% right that Sam screwed up when he said my name, because he said Candyman 5 times, and now there's a whole conversation of people who didn't even necessarily know who I was, and now they're trying to figure out, again, that social drama is stoked. Why is this guy so pissed at this guy? But speaking as Candyman. I think the key thing is that Sam has sort of wrapped what the measure of a bad idea is around, is it true or provable, and he feels that God is not provable. That's sort of his bête noire, is this idea of God. I think the problem, I was having a conversation with a friend who happens to be Christian today, and firstly, in terms of how the human mind works, the human mind can't make sense of all of the movers and players in the world, and that's why Adam Smith creates a character called the Invisible Hand that captures the broad-scale movement of all these different people in the marketplace. Richard Dawkins had to also create a character called the Blind Watchmaker. Now, this sort of large-scale character that then makes sense of all of these actions and how they all add up is not fundamentally that different from the concept of God. And it's very easy to judge people who lived in the Bronze Age, but the reality is that they didn't have the kind of information that we had. They did not have microscopes, they did not have telescopes, and so they formed the best theories they had with the data available. And we now know, for example, that many of their theories that they formed, for example, about disease, John Durant, who we had on the podcast, Mosaic Law, all of those health codes, are actually, a lot of them are pretty sound microbiology. We also know that even though they didn't understand this, that spicy foods have antimicrobial properties. So a lot of these things that were folk wisdom, they didn't necessarily rationally understand them. Nixtamalization of corn, Fijian fish taboos. A lot of these things actually science has now confirmed or come to understand. Now the question is, how do you, let's say that somebody's beliefs are problematic, how do you offer them better beliefs? Well, that's the point of the diffusion of innovations, is that rather than just sitting here and criticizing people thousands of miles away, the real challenge and the real work is to package and break down these ideas in a form that is fit to move, because they are practical, they're culturally appropriate, they're a good fit. And if you take, for example, Spiros' own country of Greece, let's look at the tax example, which I think is a great example. Why did the Greeks stop paying their taxes? Because at the time they were under the rule of the Ottomans, and it was a form of resistance to not pay your taxes. But that is now a cultural value. And if you want to go and change that in Greece, Well, that's hard because that system is constantly reinforcing itself, and it will take some really creative storytelling, some really creative marketing to be able to flip those core values, those core underlying axioms and beliefs to be able to change the social dynamic. And that's the sort of thing that Teddy Roosevelt was doing with the bully pulpit.
I think it's also taking the Greek tax example. I think there may be a different dimension also to it. That is a very important one because it's the original, the ideological one where you get the momentum of doing something and you keep doing it out of pride. But there's also the other aspect of it, which may be even more universal. And that is the idea that politicians are corrupt, right? It's a very powerful idea, okay? And also, and this is, I think, pretty amazing because it's always the other side's politicians are corrupt, not the ones you're voting for. And there's, of course, some individuals that are like, I really do think everyone is corrupt, so I'm not even voting. As you said, right? You know, Dave said most people didn't even vote. I think, like, you know, talk to the ones that didn't vote, a bunch of them, and they're like, it won't make a difference in my life. I'm screwed either way, right? So I think it's very important that we realize at some point that this happens, right? You know, that there is like, you know, you're in a situation where you feel like screwed no matter what. Right, and you need somebody on your side, and you don't have anyone on your side, so you don't know what to do. Right, you know, even in science, we feel like the same way sometimes. Okay, you're the only one working on a problem, and you're like stuck working on that problem. Nobody else is, you know, helping you. You don't even know who to talk to, so you become entrenched in this idea that this is the only problem that anyone should be working in, and then it becomes like this conspiracy theory that everyone else is against you. So, you know, I find this like to be a problem throughout.
I think it's a problem of human psychology. And I think the key thing is that I just want to go on record as saying I am not an expert on Greek culture, and I am not an expert on Greek tax situations. I know this very sort of simple story, and that's all I know. I lived in Greece for 2 years, but my Greek is terrible. And
most
so
people who say like, "Oh, I speak Greek," they mean like they read ancient Greek at some point.
Oh, I read ancient Greek at some point.
And it's not like the modern Greek. I'm like, you speak modern Greek? You have nothing better to do in your life but learn, like, you know? Yeah. By the way, I taught my girlfriend one thing in Greek. Actually, two things.
Pushti malaka.
No, that would be you if you were me, all right? Do not repeat that, by the way. I taught her, like, how to sing My Little Pony in Greek.
Oh, nice.
Spiros, I think you have to sing it for us.
Oh, should I? Okay, anyway, so My Little Pony, here it goes. Μικρό μου πόνι, ήρθε η άνοιξη ξανά. Λιώνει το χιόνι, πάνω στα βουνά. There you go. Somebody's going to go and decode what that meant, right? But there was snow up in the mountains and it melted. So
it's
I don't
gorgeous.
Know if it was like actually, I try.
But I think this gets to crucially, you know, we've been talking about the need to set up dojos in as many countries as possible. And the key thing is that there are, obviously there's our shared humanity, but there are cultural differences. And so much of it is that there is local knowledge that we're not going to have. I don't speak Greek. I don't know all of the different dynamics in what makes that tax situation dysfunctional. And but I think the crucial thing is that even though I don't know those specifics, that many of those patterns sound awfully familiar and sound like the sort of patterns that we see here in the US, where, you know, we tell one story about our side and our politicians, we tell another set of stories about the other side, and then we don't vote. And then we say, oh, but politicians are all corrupt, so why not anyway? And that makes internal emotional sense, but it doesn't, once you start to unpack that, you're like, oh, wait, if we all just voted, then we could potentially change things.
It is a self-fulfilling prophecy, I guess I was trying to say that before too, because when you don't trust the other side politicians, right, and you're like, no, I'm not going to pay tax, I'm going to evade, find a way to just, you know, also... Because many Greeks, I think, you know, we love the good life, right? You know, a little souvlaki here and there. It's not expensive, but, you know, being unproductive is what we do, okay? So we work long hours without helping anyone, especially in the public sector, right? You know, we take pride in that. But there's this other aspect that once you like your side of politics, right? Not because of the ideology of it. No, it's much more practical. It's more tribal than that, right? How do you disrupt this feeling that your second cousin thrice removed, who is the mayor of the town or whatever, right? Has allegiance to your son or your daughter before the kid that really deserves that position, right? As a public servant, the one who is not just passionate, but also has all the training and skills to be amazing and to elevate the whole construct, instead of destroying everything and then reinforcing that belief that everybody's incompetent in politics, right? How do you disrupt that? Because it comes down to, in my mind, it comes down to something more fundamental, which is a lack of superpowers, right? So somehow we feel, once we grow up, that we are no longer cool. We're no longer capable of changing the world with our own two hands. We wait for Godot. We wait for somebody else, right, to do it. Somebody else is better than us. We're old now. We saw, we were not the best student. We're not the best athlete. We're not the coolest kid, all that stuff, right? It gets you down. So you're like, that's not going to be me. Not only that, I don't have the tools to help my own kids. And that's huge, by the way, right? I think we discussed it years ago, Hunter, that to change the world, you don't have to do it yourself. You just have to invest and help the kids of the powerful and the rich and everyone actually in the world, because most human beings who do have kids, right, they care about their kids for some reason even more than themselves. No matter how self-important they may feel and everything, that's very important. So it's about the next generation, whether we like it or not. But I think it's important to focus on that, right? To understand that these people that they don't believe that they have the tools to help their kids, they will take the easy way out. In Greece, I think this is what's actually happening, right? Well, I mean, of course you want your kid to be successful and do better than you and all that stuff. We saw that in the US too, right? A big part of the Trump support base was exactly that. Where Appalachians that all of a sudden their kids could not even make as much money, however little that was, that they could make, because they had this path, right? Manufacturing, whatever it was, that they could do. And they didn't even realize that it wasn't the Mexicans or the Chinese or the Indians taking their kids' jobs. It was themselves. They were the ones that are keeping their own children from reaching their full potential, where they cannot be raised by automation, by cheaper labor. They transcend that, right? So they exit the matrix, right? And it's very difficult to exit the matrix when you have no tools, you don't know, right? It's a self-fulfilling, prophecy. You weren't Harvard educated to have the social capital and all that stuff, right? Your mom didn't write Golden Girls, right? So I'm sorry. We're talking about the show right now, just to clarify. So, you're kind of stuck, right? You're kind of stuck, and you end up hating, with good reason, everybody else who is talking about you as if they know you, right? And telling you no, but why did you vote for somebody like that, right? They don't even care about you, which is true actually about Trump, right? They don't even have a way to help you. They're just paying lip service. But at least somebody paid attention to you. Somebody said you matter, right? You exist with all your faults. Here you are, and your kids are going to be in pain. No one wants that. I don't care, I have some rich friends, right, with very, very entitled children, and I don't like that very much, right? But even then, I try to understand that even being super rich comes with a lot of baggage, right? Where you may not even have the motivation to do great things because you can never outdo your parents, right? It feels like that. You're hitting a ceiling. You cannot, so that's I think why very often these kids end up doing something completely different. They try maybe even something that their parents really hate, they try to escape, to find themselves, to do their own thing. And very often kids from either spectrum, right, socioeconomic spectrum, are stuck. They don't have a way to do it. They're imprisoned, and no matter what we say, right, it's not going to make a difference. I guess the only thing you can do, again, that's why I love mixed mental arts, and its foundation is because you end up giving them tools.
And that is exactly the point. And so much of what you've just said, Spiros, is a beautiful encapsulation of where we are. So we've been talking a lot about the jobocalypse and just the degree to which all these jobs are disappearing to automation. And What the irony is that the approach that it's going to take to succeed in this new environment, that is an environment that is defined by constant change, is the scientific approach. It is that experimental mind where you're constantly testing, refining, trying to figure out new ways. And we have this Alvin Toffler quote, learn, unlearn, relearn, which you can now get as a t-shirt from tpublic.com/mixed mental arts, along with some excellent t-shirts done by The Unicorn and My Little Pony. And now I'm sensing a mashup of Spiros singing My Little Pony in Greek and Nicole Page. That's the key thing also is that mashups. Innovation, we think, again, is this super revered process, but it is this very simple process of just combining two things that have never existed before. It's not that that's necessarily easy. If you look at the challenges that you're having in trying to combine quantum field theory and general relativity, often, and I'm going to use it, idea sex is remarkably difficult because the things don't seem to fit together. And even somebody like Roy Choi coming up with the Korean barbecue burrito, it's not that he's like, great, I figured this thing out. There's a real process of trying to figure out, okay, there are all these Korean flavors and there are all these Mexican flavors, and how do I marry these two? And it takes time to figure out how to marry those two in a productive combination. So it takes work and it takes challenges, but that's really the point, is that the goal of the Straight A Conspiracy and the goal of mixed mental arts is the whole point is to empower others. It's about the difference between what is an education versus what is indoctrination. And indoctrination is beating in a way of thinking. You're putting a doctrine into people's heads. And education comes from the Latin educare, so to lead out. So I'm leading you out of yourself, and that's the goal. I'm not interested in putting into people's heads a set of prescribed ideas, some sort of orthodoxy. I'm interested in drawing them out so they can question orthodoxy and so they can think for themselves. And that's the real point of this project. And I think so much of what we need are people like you who are good at what they do and but are fundamentally approachable and open to those questions. And what we need are people like Cate Fogarty, how many Twitter followers do you have, Kate? 5 people who have 5 Twitter followers who then jump in, and then you're like, oh, wow, she's really good at this thing, and I never even knew she was out there. And people like Dave who are there to make fun of me, but who also defy our categories, where here's a guy who's funny and has to think hard about writing jokes, but then when he's drinking beers, does theoretical physics.
And I have 85,000 Twitter followers. I do, just not on my main account.
Yeah. Tell us about that other account, Dave.
No? It was called Next to Kim Davis. I made fun of the woman Kim Davis. I got Twitter drunk for a weekend for 2 weeks. I got 100,000 followers in a couple of weeks, and it made me crazy. And that's not a good thing to have happen to you, by the way. It really messes up your brain pretty bad.
Because you want to say hi to everyone, right?
No, because you just start going the world is mine, everything's happening, all these people love me, and it's nothing. It's just a random. It's a pretend number that's getting bigger.
They love the idea.
But that's power. That's what power does to people. They get drunk on power, and that's why all power has to be held accountable. And Dave saw me at my most Twitter drunk post Rogan, and that's a large part of it too, is that I was Twitter drunk.
You referred to yourself as Jesus at one point.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, there were a lot of bad ideas that happened in that moment. But you three, Andrew and I have known each other for 10 years probably. That's about right?
Yeah.
We did stand up back in the day, and then we lost touch. And we've come at I've come at it from the science and cultural evolution. You've come at it from
my mentor, Jacques Fresco, in Florida, in Venus, Florida. I spent a lot of time studying with him, and he kind of taught me about how environment shapes behavior and how we are all, whether we know it or not, reflections of our culture and our environment. And, the effect that can have on you if you are raised to believe that environment shapes behavior, it's a lot easier to look at other people from different cultures and say, okay, I get that. I can put myself in your shoes. I can hold two opposing values and see what the other person is seeing and be more empathetic. I was not raised that way. It was something that I had to learn in my 30s.
And even I think like even if we can have that level 1, level 0, I would say it's more like I don't get you, right? You're not like me. I think there's something fundamentally wrong with you. It's not even your environment, right? Even if we do go to that level 1 from level 0, right, where we say we are aware of the influence of our own environment and then the influence of your environment on you, I think I would call that the level of like love the sinner, hate the sin. Level 2 for me would be where you're like, you still like, you know, the level 1, you still hate them, right? You understand, but you're like, you hate some of the things that they represent, where they're coming, like, you know, the way they're eating with no fork and all that stuff, right? Like the Greeks, you know, you're like, whatever. I try to understand, but you know, it's kind of like when in the past, right? I was connected with other circles here in the U.S., and I would be in these family dinners, things like that, and then some of them would be like, "Oh, you're from Greece, yeah." So I was recently, like, you know, somewhere else, okay, but they thought it was the same thing, like somewhere in the Middle East, and like, oh my God, you know, I can't believe how they live there, right? You usually expect when somebody goes to a different place, right, that they start developing a bit more empathy. They're like, oh, okay, wow, I see, I get it. It was more like that level 1 is like where, oh, I see why they are the way they are. It's not their fault, it's their environment's fault, right? But their environment is not some abstract idea. It's like the wisdom of all the human beings from that culture that came before them, plus the actual physical environment, right? So you're not poo-pooing them. You're like, no, it's all your ancestors and all the crappy ideas that they had and all that stuff. But, you know, it's not really your fault. So it's one of these things where you're like, I don't really hate you, right? It's not really you. It's like everything that you represent, right? And again, I don't get that, because if you really want, right, the level 2 is where you go to these back alleys and you start trying the non-touristy stuff. You start seeing, like, you know, people in their everyday life, in the good and the bad, right? Because there is also on the left and the right here also handpicked different parts, and they say, oh yes, you know, kids in Brazil, everything is like, you know, great, they're dancing, they're having a great life. Like in Cuba, the same thing, but there's another aspect to it, the dark aspect. They're like, you know, that's okay, they're happier than us. Or like, let's all go back and live in the jungle. You know, we used to be closer to nature and everything. Like, yes, there's some truth to that, but like, you're forgetting the other part of the picture, right? And I think it is important to go to that level 2 with engaging with the other side, where you go and you try to really get, and it's not going to happen overnight, right? It's not going to go like to Japan and be like, I get it. I get those crazy Japanese. Like, you know, after 2 days, I finally get it. You have to stay there. You have to converse. They have to come to you. You have to open like a trusted, right, channel of communication between you, where, as we said at the very beginning, you do not dictate how they behave towards you. They can behave just like in a relationship. The first courtship, like, you know, the first, like, you know, month or so, you don't even know that the other person is pooping. And we all know that everybody poops, right? So they're like, oh no, they never poop, they never fart, they never sneeze, right? You know, they're wonderful people. But at some point when you're like, okay, I am ready to open up, that's where you take a leap of faith. You're willing to open up yourself so they cannot do the same. They can do the same thing, right? And we need to get there.
Well, I think in terms of level 2, I think what's important is that very often people go to countries and they do all the tourist things. You stay in some hotel and there's a very particular type of interaction there where you have some version of the local cuisine and the waiters are all dressed a certain way. There's a uniform. There's a level of distance. But it's a very, very different thing when you spend time in a country and there becomes it can just be a family that you are close with and you are living with and you are spending time around them. And when you're suddenly, you know, I mean, Jon Haidt, one of the things that I think is most interesting is that I think that so much of his work comes from he talks about spending time in India and entering into their culture on their terms. And that's so much for me. Really, a lot of I've spent time in the Arab world, but the most significant experience was really spending time in Libya. And there was one family in particular that we were very close with, and spending time with them and sort of understanding really their experience and the struggles that they go through, and having their hospitality, staying with them, understanding what it means to be born with a Libyan passport. You now have very few options in terms of employment and travel and education, and the desire to make your country work, not necessarily knowing how to do that. Even if you do have some knowledge, there's the problem of what the educational system is there and trying to turn around the educational system, and how Gaddafi used the educational system as a way to buy off people, because an easy way to buy off people is you give them a teaching job, and now, you have a salary for life, and then you would never show up to the schools. And then you go to Abu Salim, which is the poorest part of Tripoli, and you teach English there. And you come to realize that these kids don't know what the concept of a verb is. But then you're like, okay, that seems really problematic. How can you learn verbs if you don't have the concept? And then you get into a conversation of, well, the way that Arabic works is it's based on roots, and maybe in these 3 root letters and inserting other letters in. So maybe it's a hard concept to translate. Is that the same? So now you start to really get into the weeds of what are the cultural difficulties of trying to create that intercultural dialogue. But it's a problem that is serious, that deserves respect, and that deserves attention, and really requires the wisdom of crowds. If we actually, for example, want to turn around, and obviously the Greeks not paying taxes, it may be like a religion, but it's not a religion.
We religiously do not pay taxes.
Well, they described it as the national sport, right? Somebody, I think one of the prime ministers or something did.
Thought it was, that and backgammon. Yeah.
But if you want to actually engage in that work of trying to change those cultural norms, that takes a lot of work. And the United States had to change those cultural norms with the Civil Service Act, the Pendleton Civil Service Act. Presidents were shot over it. It takes a lot of work. I believe President Garfield was shot because he tried to change the Civil Service Act from basically a favors system, a patronage system, to a meritocracy, and there was a disgruntled office seeker who shot him, Guiteau. So all of these actual social change takes a lot of work. It takes real effort. It takes drawing on whatever the best knowledge that we have available in terms of the science, the history, any wisdom we can find really anywhere in any culture at any time. And that's what I'm actually interested in, is making a real difference in people's lives. And anybody who wants to be a part of that process, we would love to have your help wherever you are in the world. And if you're simply interested in being a critic and sniping from the sidelines and providing easy narratives that blame all the world's problems on something, we're also interested in talking to you.
I'm in.
Yeah. So yeah,
I gotta go.
Oh, thanks, Dave. And by the way, I just also want to apologize for my terrible audio performance. I just hit the mic stand. Christopher Leon Price, who heads up Team Werewolf, which is the audio team, has been very patiently working me through some of my audio problems. So I promise that I will keep putting the white belt on and trying to get better at that. You two should also just do a podcast, just you. I'll lend you my gear and you can go and do that. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Kate, do you have anything you want to say?
Hashtag growth mindset.
Yeah, that's it. That's a lot of what Spiros was talking about in terms of people feeling empowered and feeling they can change themselves. It's one of the ideas that we're working to diffuse, and Kate has done knowledge bombs on that. Andrew, anything you want to say?
I'd like to back channel you, Spiros, and talk a little bit about the double slit experiment more. And I'm very interested in that.
Sounds good.
I think it would be amazing, Spiros. I don't know how you feel about this, but I'm sure that lots of people have physics questions. And if you wanted to, on mixedmentalarts.co, we could do Ask a Physicist or Ask Spiros or whatever you want to do it. It's your thing.
Yeah, I would love to for the right price. I'm down.
Know the lyrics to My Little Pony.
The rest of them?
Well, Spiros, you're going to get on very well with Walid Darab, who's going to be writing about the Hadith, because he, in true Afghan fashion, every time I had a conversation with him, would say, "How much is pay?"
How much is pay? Quanto costa?
Quanto costa? Anyway, thanks so much, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for tuning in. This has been Mixed Mental Arts. You can support us on Patreon. You can support the Culture Matters series there, patreon.com/Mixed Mental Arts. And you can also buy T-shirts at TeePublic. Search for Mixed Mental Arts. And check out all the great work that people like Cate are doing at mixedmentalarts.co. And we will be dropping some of those articles as audio on this podcast feed. So if you don't have the time to read it, you'll just be able to listen to a quick little thing that will drop some knowledge in your head. Diffusing innovations, ladies and gentlemen. Diffusing innovations.